Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. Have you ever felt like your life is finally on the right track? Everything seems perfect. A new home, a new chapter, a new family. But you know what's most interesting about perfect pictures? They often hide shadows that only reveal themselves upon closer inspection. This story is about how one such perfect beginning turned into something I never expected. I thought that moving to a new house would be a fresh start for me, but it turned out to be much more complicated and tangled. Perhaps it was inevitable. Perhaps it was fate. But at that moment, I had no idea that life was preparing such trials for me. My name is Jessica, and this is the beginning of a story that changed everything. Moving into a new house always feels like the start of something special. When Andrew and I first saw our new home, I felt a warmth spread inside me. Spacious rooms, high ceilings, huge windows that let in so much light that it's impossible to stay in a bad mood. This house was our dream, a place where we could start a new life together. Andrew was busy unpacking boxes in the living room while I leaned against the doorframe, watching him. At that moment, I caught myself thinking that everything had finally fallen into place. But deep down, I felt a slight unease. Today, William, Andrew's son from his first marriage, was supposed to visit us. I had never met him, and that added a note of nervousness to our carefully planned housewarming. All those conversations Andrew had about how independent and mature William was for his 18 years filled me with a bit of awe. In any case, I knew that a lot depended on this meeting. When I heard the sound of a car pulling up, I froze for a moment. Andrew looked up, his face lighting up with a smile. I exhaled and hurried to the porch. William stepped out of the car, and I involuntarily held my breath. He was taller than I expected, with a slight nonchalance in his movements and a confident stride. His facial features were sharply defined, his hair slightly curled at the ends, creating a look that was impossible to deny as attractive. He looked more like a young man than the teenager I had imagined. "Hi, William, I'm Jessica," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and friendly. William responded with a warm smile and extended his hand. His handshake was firm, but not overly so, like that of someone confident in himself. "Nice to meet you, Jessica." His voice was deep and unexpectedly soft. I couldn't help but notice that something flickered in his gaze that puzzled me a little, but I tried not to dwell on it. We entered the house, and William, looking around, seemed genuinely impressed. "Beautiful house," he said, and I saw Andrew proudly straighten his shoulders. I, in turn, couldn't take my eyes off William, his calm confidence, his manner of carrying himself. William wasn't just attractive. He had a certain magnetism that made me feel both uncomfortable and intrigued at the same time. The evening passed quietly. We had dinner in the new dining room, enjoying the first moments of our life together in this house. Andrew shared stories about his childhood, and I watched as William laughed at his jokes. Their relationship seemed strong, and I was glad they maintained such a connection. But every time I caught William's gaze on me, something tightened inside. His eyes seemed too attentive, as if he was trying to see something that even I was hiding from myself. As the evening drew to a close, I decided that we all needed some time to get used to each other. I offered to show William around the house, to show him his room, and he readily agreed. As we climbed the stairs, I felt the atmosphere between us shift. A strange tension hung in the air, one I couldn't explain. "You're doing a great job with this house," William said when we reached his room. I nodded, trying not to show how much his presence unsettled me. William walked over to the window and looked out onto the street, then turned to me. "I think we're going to get along just fine," he said, and there was something in his voice that made me feel uneasy for a moment. But I smiled and left the room, leaving him alone, trying to understand what exactly was troubling me. When I returned to the bedroom, Andrew was already asleep. I lay down beside him, but sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts kept returning to William, to his gaze, to his smile. I told myself that all of this was just my nervousness about the new family relationships, but something inside hinted that it wasn't that simple. That evening was the beginning of something that would change my life, and I could feel it. But how and when it would happen, I didn't know. A few days had passed since William moved into our home. Life started to fall into a routine, but each day brought new feelings. Andrew, as usual, was busy with work, while I tried to adjust to the new circumstances. William, unexpectedly sociable, easily fit into our family routine. Yet, something inside me began to change. One morning, after Andrew had already left for the office, I found William in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table with a book that I had been meaning to reread for a long time. "I absolutely love that book," I said, approaching the table. "How do you like it?" William looked up and smiled. "It's amazing. I rarely come across novels that so accurately describe a person's inner world." I sat down across from him with a cup of coffee. "What's your favorite part?" He thought for a moment, as if flipping through the pages in his mind. Probably the moment when the main character finally realizes that his whole life has been a series of compromises. He understands that he can't continue living the way he has been. I nodded, acknowledging his point. Yes, that's a very powerful moment. There's so much truth in how we often sacrifice our desires for something or someone else. William looked at me with a special kind of interest. "And you? Have you ever sacrificed your desires?" I paused for a second, feeling his words resonate deep within me, maybe more than I'd like to admit. Our eyes met, and attention hung in the air. I felt his attention focused on me, and it was more than just polite interest. "You don't seem like the kind of woman who easily gives up on her desires," he said, and I caught a note of admiration in his voice. I smiled, trying to hide my embarrassment. Sometimes life forces us to be stronger than we want to be. He leaned in closer, his gaze becoming more intent. "But maybe you shouldn't always have to be strong. Sometimes you should allow yourself to be weak." I turned away, trying to return to my thoughts, but William's words kept echoing in my mind, making me think about things I had hidden even from myself. That evening, Andrew stayed late at work again. William and I decided to spend the time watching a movie. I chose an old favorite with a story about complex relationships. We sat on the couch with enough space between us, but I still felt his presence, as if it were closer than it really was. "This is one of my favorite movies," I began as the credits rolled. "I can see why. The story really resonates. I've always liked when movies show that love is not just joy, but also a struggle." "I agree," I replied. "Love isn't always easy. Sometimes you have to choose between what's right and what you want." William turned his head toward me, his eyes sparkling with interest. "Have you ever made that kind of choice?" "Every time you decide to stay loyal to someone, you make that choice," I said, feeling the weight of my words carry more meaning than just a conversation about a movie. He nodded, but there was something in his gaze that made me wary. "I think there are times in life when it's impossible to ignore your desires, even if they seem wrong." His words sounded like a quiet challenge, and I realized he wasn't just talking about the movie's plot. I felt something tighten inside me, but I didn't know how to respond. The next day, we were alone again. Andrew had left for a business meeting, and William and I decided to take a walk in the garden. We strolled slowly between the blooming bushes, discussing nature and its calming effect. "I love this garden," William said, stopping by a bed of roses. "It's a place where you can think and not be distracted by the noise of the world." "I do too," I replied. "The garden is my place of strength. Here, I feel safe." He turned to me, and in his eyes was that same mysterious depth I was beginning to recognize. "What if this place becomes something even more important for you?" I frowned slightly, not understanding where he was going. "What do you mean?" He took a step closer, his gaze serious and focused. "Have you ever thought that some encounters in life aren't accidental? That they can change everything?" I felt my heart skip a beat. His words penetrated deeper than just a casual conversation. "Are you talking about us?" He didn't look away. "Maybe. I just feel that there's something more between us than just friendship. I know it's wrong, but I can't ignore what I'm feeling." My thoughts were clouded, but I tried to remain calm. "William, this is a complicated situation. You're my stepson, and—" He gently interrupted me. "I know, and I'm not asking you to decide anything right now, but I wanted you to know that my feelings for you aren't just casual. I respect you, but at the same time—" He trailed off, and his eyes met mine. I felt the tension between us flare up again, too strong to ignore. We stood in silence, both understanding that this was a moment that could change everything. Evening had come, and as usual, I was trying to relax after a long day. Andrew was once again late at work, and I decided to spend time in the kitchen, preparing dinner. William, as always, was nearby, offering help that I must admit I hadn't even expected. His presence became a sort of comfort to me that evening, though I tried not to give it much importance. Everything began as it usually did. We were chopping vegetables, talking about weekend plans, and I noticed that the atmosphere was less tense than in previous days. Perhaps it was because we had grown accustomed to each other, or maybe it was because this evening felt special, although I couldn't quite say why. "How do you feel about the weekend plans?" I asked, stirring the sauce. William reached for another carrot and began slicing it. "I was thinking we could have a barbecue in the garden. The weather's supposed to be nice, and I noticed you have some great grilling recipes." I smiled. "That's a great idea. I haven't grilled in a while. Maybe that's exactly what we need." When dinner was ready, we sat at the table. William enthusiastically complimented my cooking skills, and I felt a bit more at ease. We continued talking, and I noticed that William had become more open. His jokes were more frequent, and I felt the invisible wall between us starting to crumble. After dinner, we decided to watch a movie. William chose something comedic, and we settled on the couch, just like that evening when I had felt tension between us. But this time, everything was different. There wasn't the same distance that had been there before. We sat close, and every glance, every touch seemed meaningful. "Do you remember in the last movie, that moment when the characters confessed their feelings to each other?" I asked, my eyes still on the screen. "Yes, I remember," William replied, his hand accidentally brushing against mine. I felt sparks run through my body from that accidental touch. He noticed my reaction and seemed to sense that something had changed as well. His hand lingered for a moment, then he cautiously pulled away. We both froze in that state, not knowing what to do next. But the electric attraction between us was so strong that I couldn't ignore it. Suddenly, William turned to me, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite define. His face was close to mine, and I felt my breath become uneven. He seemed so confident and yet vulnerable at the same time. I felt my pulse quicken, and I couldn't take my eyes off his lips. "Jessica," he said quietly, and there was a hint of hesitation in his voice that was new to me. I couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, I just waited, not understanding what was happening. And then, as if in slow motion, he leaned toward me. His lips touched mine, and I felt everything around me disappear. The first kiss was unexpected and intense. All my senses focused on that moment. I responded to his kiss, and it felt so natural and yet incredibly surreal at the same time. I couldn't understand how it had all come to this, but in that moment, it didn't matter. Only he mattered, only the two of us, and this new feeling that I couldn't ignore. When we pulled away, I saw that his eyes were full of emotions that I couldn't describe. We were silent, not knowing what to do next. I felt my heart pounding, and my thoughts were a chaotic mess. "I shouldn't have done that," I finally said, trying to regain control. William looked at me with deep care and tenderness. "Neither should I. But it happened, and I can't change that. He trailed off, and I saw his gaze travel across my face. We both knew that this kiss wasn't just a random touch, but something much more significant. We had taken a step from which there was no turning back. I took a deep breath and stood up from the couch. "I need to think," I said, trying to conceal my inner turmoil. William nodded, his face sad but understanding. "I understand. If you need time, I'll wait. I just wanted you to know that it meant something to me." I nodded and left the room, feeling my heart still fluttering. I knew that nothing would be the same. That kiss had changed everything, and I could no longer ignore my feelings. My life had reached a point where a choice had to be made, and I understood that the consequences would be far from simple. After that first kiss, everything in my life changed. I remember lying in my bedroom in the dark for a long time, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw William, his gaze, his touch. I understood that this was a moment that couldn't be ignored, but I also knew we had to act cautiously. The next morning, I tried to behave as usual. Andrew was already at the office, and William, as always, was occupied with his own affairs. I decided to prepare breakfast and try to distract myself with household chores to keep my mind off what had happened. Unfortunately, the invisible thread that connected me to William was too strong. We met in the kitchen as I was trying to set up the music player, to create a cozy atmosphere for the morning coffee. "Good morning," William said as he entered the kitchen. His voice was warm and friendly, but I noticed something more in his gaze. It was a look that reminded me of what had happened that night. "Good morning," I replied, trying to smile. "How did you sleep?" "Good," he said, not looking away. "I thought I might help with breakfast." I nodded and continued cutting the fruit. William moved closer and began helping with the preparations. We worked in silence, but every touch, every movement reminded me of what had happened between us. Once breakfast was ready, we sat down at the table. William, noticing my withdrawn mood, tried to cheer me up with his jokes. I tried to smile, but the internal tension was too great. "I think we need to talk," William began when we were alone in the kitchen. He looked at me with a serious expression. I sighed and looked at him. "Yes, I understand. But we need to be careful. We can't let anyone find out." "Agreed," he nodded. "We need to keep our distance to avoid drawing attention, but that doesn't mean we should ignore what happened between us." I felt my heart race. How are we going to do that? How are we going to handle these feelings without crossing boundaries? William was silent for a moment, then stood up and walked over to me. He stood so close that I could feel the warmth of his body. "We'll keep it a secret. And while we're here, we should try to act as normal as possible. But I want you to know, I can't just forget what happened." I felt my lips tremble slightly. "And neither can I. But we need to be careful. It's too risky." He reached out to touch me, and I felt his hands rest on my shoulders. It felt so natural and yet so tense. "I'll try. But when we're together, I can't control my feelings." We locked eyes again, and I realized that there wouldn't be an easy way out of this situation. But at that moment, I felt that the desire to be near him was too strong to ignore. With each passing day, our relationship became more intense and passionate. William and I continued to spend time together, teetering on the edge of what was permissible, yet always trying to avoid direct confrontations with Andrew. I tried not to be too noticeable, keeping busy with household chores and avoiding long conversations with my husband. One evening, when Andrew was late at work again, William and I found ourselves alone. I was preparing dinner, and he offered to help, as usual. We worked in silence, and I noticed that every sound, every touch felt more intense. "You look tired," William said, turning to me. "Do you want me to help you?" I looked at him, and feeling the tension between us growing, nodded. "Okay, thank you. I'll prepare the salad, and you can handle the main dish." He came over to me and started cooking the meat. I noticed how his movements were confident and skillful, which made me think again about how strongly I was drawn to him. Soon, I felt his gaze on me, and when I turned, I met his eyes. "I love spending time with you," he said quietly. "I like it when it's just the two of us. It's as if everything else disappears." I felt my heart flutter. "I feel the same, but it's so difficult. I constantly think about what we're doing and how it could affect all of us." He sighed and came closer, his hands touching mine. "I know. But sometimes I feel like this is the only thing that matters. We need to be together to preserve what we have." Our eyes met, and I felt that same spark ignite between us, the one that had been there on that first evening. We stood there, not looking away, and I felt his hands gently slide down my waist. At that moment, I could no longer ignore my feelings. As he moved closer, I felt my breath catch. His lips found mine again, and I responded to his kiss, feeling the passion overflow within me. At that moment, when our lips met, all the fears and doubts vanished, leaving only the sensation that this was the only right path. The kiss was full of tremor and tenderness. I felt warmth fill me, and it was more than just physical attraction. It was a feeling I couldn't put into words. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't deny that it was what I wanted. When we pulled away, I saw that William was also full of emotion. His eyes were filled with passion and tenderness, and I felt that this wasn't just a momentary weakness, but something much more significant. "I don't know what will happen next," I said, trying to regain my composure. "But I want you to know that this isn't just a game for me." He nodded, his gaze full of understanding. "I don't know what the future holds for us either, but I want to be with you, despite everything." We both understood that our situation was complicated and risky, But at that moment, we were together, and that was all that mattered. Time would tell how we would handle this new phase in our lives. But for now, we were determined to keep what we had, despite all the challenges. One day, after returning from work, I found William already waiting for me in the kitchen. His face was serious, and I could sense that he too was under a lot of stress. "Hi," I said, trying to appear as natural as possible. "How was your day?" William looked at me with concern. "Not too well. I can't stop thinking about what's going on, and I can't shake off the guilt." I sighed and stepped closer to him. "I'm worried too. Andrew has become noticeably more attentive and anxious. He started asking how I'm doing and has noticed that I've become more withdrawn." William looked at me with concern. "And what did you tell him?" "That everything's fine. But I can tell he doesn't believe me. He's been more interested in how my day goes and is trying to figure out what I'm hiding." William took my hands in his. "I'm sorry that this is so difficult. We can't keep lying and keeping this a secret. I feel terrible that this is affecting your life." I looked at him and felt my heart clench with emotion. "This isn't just your fault. We both chose this path, but I'm afraid it might destroy everything we've had." That evening, we decided to spend time in the living room, where we had more space to talk. We turned on the TV, but even that couldn't distract us from the constant feeling of anxiety. William sat next to me on the couch, and I felt his closeness like never before. "How are we going to continue?" he asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "I don't know," I replied, trying to stay calm. "We need to keep our connection a secret and hope that everything will calm down." We sat together, and I noticed that William looked downcast as well. He began to open up to me, sharing his worries and fears. It was unexpected and at the same time comforting to know that we both shared these emotions. "I'm afraid that if everything comes out, it will ruin not only our relationship, but also your life," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't want you to suffer because of me." I touched his face, feeling his warmth transfer to me. "We have to deal with this together. I can't let go of you, and I can't change what happened, but we need to be careful." At that moment, I realized that despite all the difficulties and fears, our feelings remained strong and real. We continued to hide our relationship from everyone, but each of our interactions became more and more intense. The next day, when I was alone with William again, I noticed that Andrew was even more attentive and worried. He kept asking about my well-being and noticed the slightest changes in my mood. The pressure was unbearable, and I knew we needed to find a way to keep everything a secret. We continued to meet at home when Andrew wasn't around, but each moment was filled with fear and tension. We tried to be careful, not leaving any traces, but the internal pressure kept building, and I felt I couldn't keep it inside much longer. Every morning, I woke up with the thought that this could be our last day in this situation. We discussed how best to hide our meetings and avoid suspicion, but each day brought new challenges. I could see that William was suffering from this too. He tried to find a way to ease our situation, but he also knew that we were both trapped by our own emotions. He asked me more and more often how I was coping with it, and it was both a support and a reminder of how difficult it was for us to deal with this. With each passing day, our connection became more tense and complicated. The fear of being exposed haunted us, and I knew we needed to find a way to handle it without destroying everything we had built. We continued to hide, but every moment became more dangerous and risky. The overcast morning gave way to a sunny afternoon as William and I decided to spend time together. We wanted to do something simple and pleasant to distract ourselves from the growing tension surrounding us. On this day, I wanted to forget all our problems and simply enjoy William's company. We met at a park located a few kilometers from home. This place always felt peaceful to me. Green fields, ancient trees, and a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. William was waiting for me at the park entrance, and his smile as I approached reminded me why I had started feeling so attached to him. "Hi, Jessica," William said, extending his hand to me. "Ready to spend the day outdoors?" I smiled back. "Hi, William. I'm ready. I hope we can relax a bit." We began walking along a path lined with flowers and greenery. The weather was perfect, and I felt a lightness in my heart. We talked about many things, discussing our favorite books, movies, and reminiscing about various funny moments from our past. "You know," William said as we passed a pond with ducks, I've always loved spending time in the park. It's like a way to escape from daily worries and just enjoy the moment. I understand, I replied. It really is nice here. Everything seems so calm and peaceful. We found a bench under a large tree and sat down to rest. William took out a bottle of water and offered me some. We continued our conversation, but at that moment, I felt an invisible connection growing between us. His words, his gaze, his mannerisms, everything began to feel more significant. You read a lot, right? William asked, smiling. What's your favorite genre? I nodded. Yes, I love to read. I especially enjoy romantic dramas and historical novels. They allow me to immerse myself in another world. William looked intrigued. Interesting. Do you have a favorite author? I thought for a moment. Yes, I do. I really like Jane Austen. Her books are full of emotions and complex relationships. Oh, that's a classic, William said, nodding. I like reading too. Lately, I've been into contemporary fantasy. Our conversation smoothly transitioned into discussing our favorite books and movies. William told me about his recent interests and fascinating facts he had learned. I savored every minute spent with him, feeling the trust between us growing. After we rested a bit, we continued our walk. William suggested we head to an old bridge located at the other end of the park. We walked along a path surrounded by green trees, and I noticed that William had become more open and relaxed. His words became more personal, and I began to feel that he was entrusting me with his thoughts and feelings. When we reached the bridge, I saw that the area was covered in bright flowers. William suggested taking a few photos against the natural backdrop, and we had fun posing for the camera. I felt his hand gently touch mine, and it was pleasant, making me feel more connected to him. After our walk, we decided to stop by a small cafe near the park. We ordered coffee and pastries and continued our conversation, sharing our thoughts and dreams. William talked about his future plans, and I noticed how his eyes lit up when he spoke about his goals. Time flew by unnoticed. As William and I walked each other to our cars, I felt a slight sadness that the day had come to an end. We exchanged smiles and words of gratitude for the wonderful day. Thank you for today, William, I said as we stood by the car. It was really nice. Thank you, Jessica, William replied. I'm glad I spent it with you. I hope we can do this again. As we said our goodbyes, I felt warmth in my chest from our meeting. Despite knowing the challenges that lay ahead, this day was like a small island of happiness in our turbulent sea. And though our secret remained hidden, at that moment, I was simply happy to be with William, enjoying his company and feeling our mutual attraction growing stronger. That evening began like any other. William and I were alone at home again, as Andrew had stayed late at work. This had become a routine. Every time he worked late, William and I spent time together, enjoying each other's company. We knew we were playing with fire, but we couldn't stop ourselves anymore. Our feelings had long surpassed a mere infatuation. This was a passion that we couldn't resist. I remember preparing dinner in the kitchen when William approached me from behind, wrapped his arms around me, and gently kissed my neck. I smiled, feeling his warmth, and tilted my head slightly so he could continue. William seemed to understand exactly what I felt, and his touch was always confident and alluring. We were so close that we no longer feared each other, and our communication was filled with trust and intimacy. When dinner was ready, we sat at the table, but there was something more between us than just the desire to eat. In our glances and movements, there was something noticeable only to us. Every gesture, every word, even the most ordinary, was imbued with mutual understanding and a silent promise of what would happen later. After dinner, William suggested watching a movie. It was our little ritual. We often chose old comedies that gave us a sense of lightness and tranquility. We settled on the couch, knowing that the movie was just an excuse to be together. As soon as the first scenes began, William embraced me, and I felt his closeness more intensely than ever before. William pulled me closer, and I responded, feeling us once again sinking into that sweet but dangerous state. We had long stopped thinking about how wrong this was, about the potential disaster it could lead to. We were together, and that was all that mattered at the moment. But in the middle of this moment, a sound broke through. At first, I didn't pay attention to it, but when the door lock clicked, I froze, realizing what was happening. I pulled away from William and turned toward the door. Andrew stood at the entrance, his face contorted with shock and pain. His eyes, full of horror and disbelief, were fixed directly on us. Andrew stood there, seemingly paralyzed, unable to believe what he was seeing. In that second, I felt everything inside me turn upside down. All the passion that had seemed so natural just a minute ago was now replaced by guilt and fear. His gaze pierced me, and I realized that everything William and I had tried to hide was now exposed. Everything that had been so important and precious crumbled in an instant. "What is this?" Andrew's voice was quiet but filled with pain. He stood there as if he couldn't believe his eyes, as if he was trying to convince himself that this was just a nightmare. "How could you?" The words stuck in my throat, and I couldn't utter a sound. I knew I needed to say something, but I couldn't find any justification. William also stood up, his face showing guilt and regret. He knew what had happened, and that everything would change now. Andrew took a step forward, his face a mixture of rage and disappointment. He looked at both of us, and I saw his fists clench with anger. His lips trembled, as if he couldn't find the words to express his feelings. "You betrayed me," he finally said, his voice full of pain. "I trusted you. I loved you. And you." Those words cut through me like a knife. I felt tears start to stream down my cheeks, and my heart ached with pain and fear. William tried to say something, but Andrew didn't give him a chance. "Get out, both of you!" he screamed, his voice breaking with rage. "Get out of my house, and I never want to see either of you again!" I realized we had no choice. We had destroyed everything that mattered to Andrew, and now we had to pay for it. William looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the same thing: regret, bitterness, and the realization that it was all over. We silently walked toward the exit, understanding that this was the end. The end of our secret connection, the end of our feelings, the end of everything. As we stepped outside, I felt tears streaming down my face. I couldn't hold them back. I couldn't cope with the pain tearing me apart from within. William approached me, hugged me, trying to comfort me, but it didn't help. I felt shattered, empty, and helpless. Everything we had was gone, and I didn't know how to go on. We stood on the porch, and I understood that our lives would never be the same. That evening, I lost everything that was dear to me, and the future seemed bleak and hopeless. William held me tightly, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. All we could do was try to find a way forward, but I couldn't imagine how we would cope with this. After that dreadful night, when Andrew saw William and me together, everything started to fall apart. We stood outside, and I could feel the cold air seeping into my thoughts, making them even darker. William held my hand tightly, but it brought no comfort. I knew everything had collapsed, and the world we had so carefully hidden from prying eyes was destroyed in an instant. Andrew didn't say a word as we left his house. He just stood at the doorstep, his fists clenched, his face twisted with pain and rage. It felt like I could hear his heart shattering into tiny pieces, each one destined to haunt me for the rest of my life. William and I walked away, knowing there was no turning back. We spent that night in the car. We didn't know where to go, didn't know what to do. William tried to comfort me, but I was too broken to find the words. All we could do was wait for morning, when we could figure out what to do next. That night was the longest of my life. Every hour dragged on endlessly, and I felt my entire life falling apart. The next day, we decided to stay at a small motel out of town. It was a temporary solution, but we needed somewhere to wait and think about our next steps. We rented a tiny room, where everything seemed oppressively gray and dim. I sat on the edge of the bed, hugging myself, feeling the emptiness inside me growing. William was there, but even his presence couldn't fill that void. He tried to talk to me, but all our conversations ended in silence. We both understood that what had happened wasn't just a mistake. It was a moment when everything that mattered crumbled, and now we had to somehow deal with it. A few days later, I received a summons from a lawyer. Andrew had filed for divorce. It was expected, but it still hit me like lightning. I sat in the motel room chair, holding the letter in my hands, feeling the world around me collapse. William watched me, his face showing concern and guilt. "This was bound to happen," he said quietly, sitting down beside me. "I know it hurts, but we have to go through this together." I nodded, but tears filled my eyes again. The divorce was inevitable, but that didn't make it any less painful. I felt like a traitor, having destroyed not only my marriage, but also the life of the person who loved me. Despite all the problems between Andrew and me, I never thought it would end like this. It was too sudden, too cruel. Andrew's lawyer suggested that I sign the divorce agreement without any claims to property. He wanted me out of his life as soon as possible, and I understood him. I couldn't demand anything after what I had done. William supported me, but even he couldn't drown out the pain I felt. We decided to start a new life, though neither William nor I knew what that meant. We decided to rent a small apartment in the city where no one knew us, where we could try to start over. The idea seemed utopian, but we had no other choice. We could no longer hide, and this was the only possible solution. The apartment we found was far from the life I was used to. A small space with minimal furniture, but it was our new refuge. We began to set up our life, trying to distract ourselves from thoughts of the past. But every morning, when I woke up in this new, unfamiliar room, I felt my life becoming more and more alien and unrecognizable. William tried to help me adapt, but I could see that he was struggling too. We both found ourselves in a situation where our previous life was left behind, and the new one seemed frighteningly uncertain. He found a job, and we started to rebuild our lives. But I knew that none of these external changes could erase what we had lost. The first few weeks in the new apartment were agonizing. I kept thinking about what had happened, about how I had ruined my life and Andrew's life. William and I continued to live together, but the tension between us grew. We both understood that our bond had been tested, and that test had become too heavy for us. The divorce was finalized a few months later, and from that moment on, I never saw Andrew again. I knew he was trying to forget me, to erase everything that had been between us, and I didn't blame him for it. William and I tried to build a new life, but our past haunted us. Every time we talked about the future, the memory of how we ended up here cast a shadow over us. My life would never be the same again, and I didn't know if I would ever find peace. William and I continued to live under the same roof, but each day I felt that a new barrier had arisen between us, a barrier created by our actions and their consequences. We had lost not only the past, but also the serenity we once shared. Now we had to live with what we had created and try to find a new path forward, even if that path seemed endlessly long and difficult. A few months had passed since William and I moved into our new apartment. At first, everything felt new and fresh. A chance to start over gave us hope that we could overcome any difficulties. But over time, reality began to weigh down on us more and more, and our life together grew increasingly complex. William was only 18, and this became evident in every aspect of our lives. He was just beginning his journey. His interests and desires were natural for his age. He wanted to explore the world, take up new hobbies, socialize with friends, and savor life. I, on the other hand, was at a completely different stage in my life. I was more concerned with stability and security for the future, tired of experiments, and yearning for calm. We often argued about trivial matters that once seemed insignificant. For example, how to spend our weekends. I wanted to stay in, cook something delicious, and watch a movie, while William wanted to go out, meet friends, or go to a club. These disagreements began to pile up like a snowball, and soon every conversation turned into a discussion about how different we were. One evening, after another argument, William came home later than usual. I was sitting on the couch, trying not to think about where he might have gone. When he finally appeared, I felt a mixture of relief and irritation. "Where have you been?" I asked, trying to remain calm, though inside I was boiling. William looked at me with a hint of fatigue. "Just met with some friends. We decided to unwind a bit." "You didn't even call," I remarked, realizing my words sounded like a reproach. "I was worried." He shrugged, as if it didn't matter. "You know I need to get out sometimes. It doesn't mean I've forgotten about you." "But you could at least give me a heads up," I said, feeling the mounting tension engulf me again. "I just want you to be more responsible." "More responsible?" he repeated, his voice growing colder. "You're talking to me like I'm a child, Jessica. I don't want my life to be about reporting every step I take to you." These words cut deeper than I had expected. I understood how he felt, but I couldn't ignore how much we had begun to drift apart. We lived together, yet it felt like we were on different planets. "I don't want to control you," I said, trying not to raise my voice. "I just want us to be partners, for you to consider my feelings." He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. clearly frustrated. But we can't be on the same wavelength, you know? You want one thing, I want another. And that's not going to change. We were silent for a few minutes, each lost in our thoughts. I felt the chasm between us widening and couldn't think of a way to bridge it. William got up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "You know, Jessica," he started after a long pause, his voice quiet and contemplative, "I think we both knew this couldn't go on forever." I felt my heart clench. "What are you talking about?" He turned to me, and in his eyes, I saw what I had feared, an awareness that our time together had come to an end. "We tried, honestly tried," he continued, not taking his eyes off me. "But we're too different. I'm not ready to live the life you want. I'm not ready for commitments, for family life. I'm still too young, Jessica." I looked at him, feeling a battle of emotions within me. I knew he was right, but didn't want to admit it. We had been through so much together, and I thought we could overcome anything. But now everything seemed so fragile and vulnerable. "You talk as if you've already decided everything," I said, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. He moved closer and took my hand. "I don't want to hurt you. I never wanted to. But I can't keep living as if nothing is happening. We're both unhappy, and that's not what I want for us." I couldn't hold back the tears. William's words tore me apart because I knew he was speaking the truth. We had started this journey with hope, but now it was clear that we were too different to continue together. "You're right," I whispered, feeling tears streaming down my cheeks. "We tried, but it didn't work." He nodded and hugged me gently, as if trying to soften the pain of parting. I clung to him, feeling the warmth of his body, and knew these were the last moments we would spend together. We both understood that our time was up. Soon, William began packing his things. He wasn't in a hurry, trying to do everything calmly and without fuss. I watched him, feeling a pang of sorrow inside, but knowing that this was the only right decision. We couldn't continue deceiving ourselves. When he finished, we both stood by the door, and I felt that this farewell was the hardest of my life. "Thank you for everything you did for me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. William looked at me with sadness and a slight smile. "And thank you, Jessica. You gave me more than I could have asked for." He kissed me on the cheek, and I felt the last piece of our past dissolve. He opened the door and left, leaving me alone in the empty apartment where every corner reminded me of our shared days. I stood by the door, not knowing for how long, but when I closed it, I realized that I was alone. It was empty and silent inside, and the silence echoed throughout the apartment. I knew I would have to start over, but this path was no longer as frightening as it once was. Our paths had diverged, and although it was painful, I understood that we had made the right choice. Sometimes love cannot overcome all obstacles, and there is truth in that as well. I knew that time would heal the wounds, and someday I would find my way, even if it was completely different from what I once imagined. After William left, the apartment was filled with a deafening silence. It wasn't the cozy quiet I had once sought, but an icy, empty silence that pierced the heart, making it constrict with every beat. I sat on the couch, surrounded by things that now seemed alien. Everything William and I had shared was gone, leaving only a bitter taste of loss. Evenings became the hardest. Every sound, every flicker of light reminded me of what I had lost. I wandered through the apartment like a ghost, trying to find something to fill the emptiness inside. But it was all in vain. The world I had built had crumbled the moment I allowed myself to succumb to passion, forgetting what truly mattered. I recalled Andrew, his kindness, his care, the love he gave me. Memories of our life together came flooding back. How he surprised me, how he supported me through tough times, how we laughed together over little things. And now, all these memories had turned into a heavy burden of guilt I couldn't shake off. Every day, I asked myself the same question. Why did I allow myself to make such a mistake? Why did I betray the person who loved me more than anything in the world? I tried to find justifications, to understand what drove me to William, but in the end, I realized that no reasons could justify what I had done. One night, when I could no longer cope with the flood of emotions, I took my phone and found Andrew's number. I stared at the screen for a long time, hesitating to press the call button. What could I say to him? How could I explain that I now understood the depth of my mistake? But inside me grew an irresistible desire to at least hear his voice, to say how deeply I regretted everything. I dialed his number, and my heart raced wildly. The phone rang for a long time, and I was almost ready to hang up when suddenly I heard his voice. "Hello?" He sounded so familiar, so calm, that a lump formed in my throat. I remained silent, unsure of how to begin. Thousands of thoughts raced through my mind, but none could express what I felt. "Who is this?" Andrew asked, his voice full of anticipation. "Andrew! It's me, Jessica," I finally said, feeling my hands tremble. I wanted to say that." He was silent, and I knew he was listening, but not interrupting. I sighed and continued. "I'm so sorry. I know I can't fix anything, but I want you to know that I realize what a terrible mistake I made. You were right, and I was too blind to see it. I destroyed everything we had, and I hate myself for that." Andrew didn't respond for a long time, and I began to think that he had simply hung up. But then I heard his deep sigh. "Jessica," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "I've heard this in my head many times. I imagined you saying it, how it should sound. But you know what I've realized? Apologies won't change anything. Everything that was between us is gone. You chose another path, and now you'll have to live with the consequences." His words pierced me deeply, but I knew he was right. I knew our marriage was destroyed, and no words or apologies could change that. "I understand," I whispered, struggling to hold back tears. "I just wanted to tell you that I regret it." He fell silent again, and then said with a hint of sadness, "Take care of yourself, Jessica." Then there was a click, and the call ended. I put down the phone and felt tears start to roll down my cheeks. It was over. The end of everything I knew, everything that mattered. And I realized that I had to learn to live with it. With the loss, the pain, the realization that I had destroyed my own life. Weeks passed, and I tried to find a way to move forward. But every day felt like the previous one. I would get up, wander through the apartment, trying to distract myself, but memories of the past kept coming back. I knew time was supposed to heal wounds, but these wounds were too deep. I kept replaying in my mind the events that led me to this moment. I remembered meeting William for the first time, how his youth and passion captivated me, making me forget what was truly important. I allowed myself to be swept away by fleeting emotions, forgetting about the person who loved me and was willing to do anything for me. And now I had to pay for it. One evening, sitting by the window and looking at the streetlights, I finally realized that I could no longer live in the past. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could try to find new meaning in my life. I decided to start small, by forgiving myself. It was the hardest thing, but I knew that without it, I couldn't move forward. When everything is behind you, and all that remains are memories, the realization of mistakes comes with all its harshness. I, Jessica, destroyed my life with my own hands. I thought I had found something new, something better, but instead, I lost everything that was truly important. My betrayal not only shattered my marriage, but also destroyed me. Andrew loved me, and I didn't value that until it was too late. I betrayed his trust, and now nothing can bring back what was between us. William was just an illusion, a fleeting obsession that seemed so exciting, but turned out to be emptiness and pain. If I could go back, I would do everything differently. Don't repeat my mistakes. Love and trust are the most valuable things between people. Cherish them. Don't let moments of weakness destroy what really matters. Because when everything is destroyed, only regret remains.